Indian economy, we had started Unit 5, Industrial Policy, and you would recall that in the last sessions that we had started talking about industrial policy, and I had given you a brief introduction of industrial policy. Then we talked about the scope as well. You would recall that then we followed this up with the discussion on industrial policy of 1956. And now is the time for us to discuss industrial policy 1991. I hope you remember that there were some other industrial policies also in 48 and 77 and 80, but we are not discussing them. We are moving straight away to industrial policy 1991 because this is considered to be a big shift in the kind of economic system that we had, and it also is a break in the sense that before 1991 the India's GDP growth rate used to hover around 3-4-5%, but it happened after 1991, within a decade of 1991, that we started looking at a GDP growth rate of 7-8%, 8.5% or something in this range. So that is why it is also considered to be a watershed as far as the Indian economy is concerned. Now let us understand the industrial policy of 1991. It is also known as the New Economic Policy, NEP or NIP. So don't get confused if somebody asks you what is NIP or what is NEP, New Economic Policy or New Industrial Policy. And it was necessitated due to circumstances. So it was not as if it was a voluntary decision on the part of the government here in India to come up with a new policy altogether in 1991, which was a major change from the existing industrial policies. It was actually necessitated due to circumstances. There were so many things which happened which ultimately forced us to go for industrial policy 1991, launch a new industrial policy 1991 and open up the economy. So what was it that actually forced us to do this? Number one, there were recessionary trends in the economy. I hope you remember your discussion in macroeconomics where you have talked about the 4 stages of a business cycle. So you know that we have recovery, growth, and then we have recession and then depression. So recession is when the economy is starting to slow down a bit. So recessionary trends had started emerging as far as Indian economy is concerned. We had a very high fiscal rate, 8% of the GDP. And the revenue deficit was even also very high, 2.6% of our gross domestic product. Now, what are fiscal deficits and revenue deficits? For that, you will have to refer to your notes in macroeconomics. In macroeconomics, we have talked about fiscal deficit as well as revenue deficit. And if you still have a problem, you can refer to the macroeconomics video lecture on the same channel. You can go to the macroeconomics playlist and look for fiscal deficit and revenue deficit and go through those video lectures, right? I would not be able to discuss because it is going to consume a lot of time, and that is why I am asking you to refer to the video lectures in the macroeconomics playlist on this very channel, right? All I can tell you right now is that high fiscal deficit is not considered to be good for the country. A fiscal deficit in the range of 1-2%, around that figure, is considered to be good, and that is perfectly natural in a growing or a developing economy. But anything beyond 3% is not considered to be very, very good. And that is why there is a law also which mandates the government to bring the fiscal deficit to somewhere around 3% of the GDP. The same law also mandates the government to bring the revenue deficit down to 0%. There should be no revenue deficit at all. On the other hand, this is what basically I am telling you is the ideal situation, where the fiscal deficit is somewhere around 3% of the GDP while revenue deficit is 0. Absolutely no revenue deficit. On the other hand, what had happened in 1991 and the preceding years, our fiscal deficit had grown to 8%, almost 3 times of what ideally it should be. It ideally should be 3%, but it had gone to almost 8%. Revenue deficit should not be there, but it was already 2.6%. So that was something that we had to worry about at that point of time. Inflation was also very, very high. Ideally, the inflation should be somewhere around 4-5%. That is perfectly normal in a growing economy, a developing economy. This too, you have studied in macroeconomics. Again, If you do not know about how the inflation is calculated, what all factors lead to inflation, you can again refer to the macroeconomics lecture on this very YouTube channel. In the macroeconomics playlist you can go and then look for this particular topic and you would find the video lecture and go through that, right? All I can tell you right away is that inflation somewhere in the range of 2 to 6% is what is expected to be okay, and that is why in India also the target that has been given to the Monetary Policy Committee, which is formed by members from both RBI as well as the government, the target that has been assigned to us is 2 to 6%, or in other words we can say 4 plus minus 2%. So 4 plus 2% is 6% and 4 minus 2% is 2%. So 2 to 6% should be the range of inflation. But you can see that the inflation was much higher than that, way higher than that, almost triple of that, 17%. And there was a fall in the industrial production also. So this was the scenario at that point of time. Volume of production in the industries was also decreasing. And then we were staring at a BOP crisis. Now what is BOP? Again, you will have to go through international business. We have discussed this already in international business. There you know already what BOP means, balance of payment crisis. To put it very, very simply, BOP is when your net earnings from export are much less than the net expenditure on imports, right? And ultimately what will happen, there would be a scarcity of foreign exchange in your economy, and that is what is known as balance of payment crisis. Fine. Again, if you still have a problem in this, you can again refer to the international business playlist on this very YouTube channel and you can look for BOP there and you'll get to understand what BOP is, right? So as far as BOP crisis is concerned, we were staring at a BOP crisis. Our foreign exchange reserves had reduced to just $1 billion. And what is the amount today? If you look at the figure, the current figure of forex reserves, you would find that it is somewhere in the range of $500 billion. At that point of time, we were only left with $1 billion, and that would have been sufficient only for us to import for 6 weeks. So we could have paid for these international imports for these foreign imports only till 6 weeks. We could not have paid beyond that. This was the kind of resource crunch, this was the kind of reserve crunch that we are facing at that point of time. $1 billion would have been utilized in paying for the imports in the next 6 weeks, 1.5 weeks. So this was a big crisis for us at that point of time, and the government was forced to mortgage its gold, girvi rakhna pada gold with IMF. And why did we go to IMF? Because you know, again, this is something again that you have studied in international business, that IMF is a body which was founded after World War II to help out those countries who were facing foreign exchange crisis, the BOP crisis. So since we were also facing this BOP crisis, we went to IMF, and IMF said that we will have to mortgage our gold in case we want some help from the IMF, and we had to do that. We were forced to do that. And this happened under the watch of Prime Minister Chandrasekhar. At that point of time, he was the Prime Minister. The earlier governments were also cognizant of the fact that if the situation doesn't improve, they will have to mortgage gold or they will have to face BOP crisis. The earlier government was formed by Mr. VP Singh, so they were also cognizant, but the only thing was they didn't want to mortgage gold because that would have created a lot of negative publicity for them among the voters. But Chandrasekhar, as the Prime Minister, Mr. Chandrasekhar didn't have any other option, and he had to allow mortgaging of Indian gold at that point of time. Then, as I said, when we asked IMF, International Monetary Fund, to help us, they said that we will have to abide by some conditions that they will put on us. So these conditions were known as conditionalities, and one of the conditions was that we had to open up our economy, and that was the reason we were forced to open up our economy, what you know as globalization. We were forced to go for liberalization. The reason was because this was a necessary condition which was attached with the IMF loan. So if we wanted to get IMF loan so that we could have somehow taken care of the BOP crisis, we had to go by what IMF told us, and that is why we actually went for opening up of the economy at that point of time. As I was telling you, that it was necessitated due to circumstances, the 1991 policy. And there was a lot of political instability. In 1989, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was the earlier Prime Minister, was replaced at the center. His government's tenure was getting over in 1989, but the Congress could not win the next elections. The elections were won by the Janata Dal government and Mr. VP Singh came to power, but then he was also not able to retain the control for a long period of time, and then he was toppled, and then Mr. Chandrasekhar came to power. So within a span of 3 to 4 years, from 1989 to 1991 or 92, we saw 4 different prime ministers and 4 different governments. So this was the kind of political instability at the center, and this forced us to go for industrial policy 1991. As I told you, is known as new economic policy, and we have seen that it was necessitated by these factors. We have already discussed them in the last slide. Now, in industrial policy 1991, government introduced some of the features which were then given the acronym LPG: liberalization, privatization and globalization. Now, what do we mean by liberalization? Freeing the industrial sector from bureaucratic control and restrictive regulations. You have read about Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act in business environment. You have read about FERA and FERA, Foreign Exchange Regulation Act also. You have also read about the various kind of licensing requirements which were there for any industrial house which wanted to set up its unit here in India, be it a domestic industrial house, be it a foreign industrial house. In fact, the licensing requirements were so strict that that particular era before 1991 was known as the era of license Raj or era of permit Raj. Permit Raj is what? Permission. So the document which gives you the permission to start a particular enterprise is known as the permit, and that is why I used to call it permit Raj and license Raj, because you had to go for license whenever you want to set up a new unit, even if you want to expand it, even if you want to diversify it. For all such things you had to go to the government and ask for licenses, and the government had a mechanism wherein they used to monitor all the industries, whether they are abiding by the provisions in the licenses or not, whether they are applying for licenses before starting off a new unit or before expanding. And for that the government had inspectors, and that was why that era was also known as Inspector Raj. So we had license Raj, Inspector Raj, permit Raj at that point of time. I hope you recall our discussion in Unity 2 where I said that this is generally a feature of command and control economies, which are basically controlled by centralized authority. And since the central authority itself cannot monitor all the industries in the economy, they employ bureaucrats. Many of these bureaucrats are known as inspector. For example, we still have this provision of a factory inspector. Fine. So likewise, there were inspectors at that point of time, and that was why that particular era before 1991 was also known as license Raj or Inspector Raj or permit Raj. And the whole idea was of liberalization was that such requirements would not be mandatory in future, and industries would be free to operate except for a few industries, of course, which we will have a look in the coming sessions. Then privatization also took place, selling off loss-making public sector enterprises. It was found out that if a public sector enterprise was making loss, then it was understood that there is no use government continuing to own that particular public sector enterprise and government continuing to spend the taxpayers' money on upkeep of that PSU. Fine. So it was decided that such loss-making PSUs will be privatized. They would be sold off. Now, what do we mean by privatization? I hope you recall our earlier discussions where I told you the difference between privatization and disinvestment. In privatization, the majority owner earlier is the government, and then the government sells its majority stake to some private company. So a company, a PSU, which earlier used to exist as a public sector unit, would then be under the control of a private entrepreneur or under the control of a private enterprise, and then it would become a private unit, a private enterprise, right? So this is what privatization is. Disinvestment is different. In disinvestment, only a very small share, a minority share, is sold by the government. Fine, the majority stake, the majority ownership still remains with the government. So what was decided was at that point of time that all the loss-making PSUs would be privatized. They would be sold off to private players. So that is why we call this, we also know 1991 policy as LPG, and P stands for privatization. What do we mean by globalization? Globalization means integrating with the globe, integrating with the larger world. And how do you do that? You allow cross-border movement of goods, means from one country to the other country you allow the movement of goods. Not only goods but also services. Not only this, even money, technology, and even people. So you are allowing foreign-made goods to come to India, services provided by some foreign firms to be provided to customers here in India, or you are allowing companies operating in India to obtain finance, obtain loans from some foreign banks or some foreign institutions. If you are allowing foreign firms to sell their technology to somebody here in India, if you want people from foreign countries to enter India and to work here, this is what we know as relaxing restriction on cross-border movement. You are basically easing the cross-border movement of goods, finance, technology, and human resources. Fine. And this was what happened. Not only this, we also allowed the homemade goods to be exported to different countries. We also allowed the movement of people, the movement of worker from our economy to some other economies, and all such restrictions were then lifted. Services could also be exported to foreign countries. So all such restriction on cross-border trade, on movement of technology, movement of service providers, movement of human resources, for example, that they were relaxed, and that is why LPG is the acronym that we use: liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Fine. Now, in the next session that we'll have, we'll be talking about industrial policy 1991 and specifically the provisions regarding the public sector. Okay, so thank you very much for your time today.